Are you curious about what it would be like to ask for wine advice from the legendary Hugh Johnson, author of the World Atlas of Wine, among many other books? What would he advise you on how you could improve your wine tasting skills and pleasure? Why was Hugh initially against wine scoring, and how has his perspective actually changed over the years? What makes a wine great, in Hugh's opinion? And why does he now prefer English sparkling wines over his longtime favorite, Pol Roger Champagne? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in a rare and exclusive interview with Hugh Johnson, the world's best-known wine writer. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover how a late-night tasting of a pair of red wines led to Hugh's aha moment with wine. What makes Chablis such a versatile wine? What happens to our bodies when we drink sparkling wine? How Hugh's first writing job at Vogue magazine led to his extensive wine writing career. What inspired Hugh's first book, Wine, which was published when he was just 27 years old. How the World Atlas of Wine revolutionized the way wine and wineries were understood, and the most surprising changes Hugh has seen in the world of wine over the 60 years he's been writing about it. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 313. I am so excited about today's episode. Hugh Johnson is a giant in the world of wine writing, and he rarely does interviews anymore. The last one was several years ago. So I was not only nervous about asking him to talk with me, but when it came time to actually log into our video call, there he was sitting in a big armchair in his home in London, and I nearly fainted. He was, however, as generous and kind as he's always been over his 60-year career. A decade ago, my publisher asked him to endorse my second book, Unquenchable, which to my surprise, he did. I don't know, how does the man find time to do all that he does and then spend 8 hours reading some Canadian newbie's book? And even though he is now 85 years old, he was as sharp as a tack, recalling memories from his student days at Cambridge University and as an incredibly young writer and editor at Vogue magazine. We talked for almost an hour and a half, and he never flagged. And when we were finished, he said, "Call any time. It was immensely pleasurable." I can't even do his accent, but oh, what a gentleman. I was drenched in sweat as I thanked him. You can watch the video of our chat on YouTube. 2 of you will win a copy of his new memoir, The Life and Wines of Hugh Johnson. This is far more than a list of his favorite wines. Hugh is an elegant writer and offers fascinating stories behind the wines he spotlights. It's like having a dinner conversation with your most interesting wine friend, which is how I hope you'll feel about our conversation. All you have to do is email me and let me know that you'd like to win. I'll choose 2 people randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. It does not matter where you live. Maureen Harriman from Ontario has won a copy of Tony Edwards' new book, The Very Good News About Wine. I still have 1 copy left of the following books to give away, so email me if you want them. Inspirational Memoirs and Memories of the Women Who Shaped Ontario's Grape and Wine Industry by Jennifer Willem. The Smart Traveler's Guide to Rioja, edited by Adam Lechmere. And Wine Bites, 64 Simple Nibbles That Pair Perfectly with Wine by Barbara Scott Goodman. In other bookish news, if you've read the paperback or ebook, or are listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, I would love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. If you'd like to give this book as a holiday gift, I'd be happy to send you personally signed book plates, both for yourself and for the copies you give as gifts. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemaclean.com/313. Okay, on with the show. Hugh Johnson is the world's best-known wine writer, having sold more than 20 million books worldwide over a 60-year career. He began acquiring his wine knowledge as a student and member of the Wine and Food Society at Cambridge University before becoming the feature writer for Vogue and House and Garden magazines. In 1963, he succeeded the legendary gastronome Andre Simon as editor of Wine and Food. At the same time, he became the wine correspondent for the Sunday Times, then published his first book at the age of 27, followed by the World Atlas of Wine, Wine Companion, and his annual pocket wine book. His talent for making the subject of wine irresistible is unmatched. He is not only the world's most respected wine writer, but he is also the most loved, as his kindness both inside and outside the industry has made him a hero to many, including myself. He joins us now from his home in London, England. Hugh, it's so great to have you here with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for transporting me all overseas.
That's great, yes. We're traveling cross-Atlantic tonight. All right. Now, you and I are both sipping on tea, but it is that time of the day, perhaps sliding into cocktail hour soon. Do you have any wines planned for tonight, this evening, that you'll be sipping on?
Well, actually, tonight, I know that we are having, as we so often do, fish. My wife, Judy, and I are mad about fish, and so a lot of our wine is white. And among white wines, I have an absolute thing for Chablis. If I were limited to one white wine in the world, it would be Chablis.
Chablis, and why is that? That's the Chardonnay, for those who don't know, from northern Burgundy. But what is it about Chablis that you love so much, Hugh?
It's so straightforward. It's an unoaked white wine from Chardonnay, which is the king of white wine grapes, there's no question. It can do fancy things. It can be subtle. It can be extraordinary in that way. It can also just be the best damn white wine you ever had to go with what you're eating.
I love that.
I've got an awful lot of Chablis from various producers. There are many, many good producers in that quite small region in the north of France. I hardly have to think. I just say, yeah, we'll have Chablis again.
It's an easy choice, especially with fish. All right, let's start with your aha moment wine, your Damascene moment that happened during a late night tasting with a fellow student at King's College while you're at Cambridge University. Maybe share that with us.
Yes, I was in our rooms working or pretending to work one evening when in came my roommate in a dinner jacket, slightly disheveled, I think, and said, Hugh, you've just got to taste this. And he gave me a glass of red wine. I wasn't reluctant to stop my studies and taste it. I said, this is absolutely good. I never tasted anything like this. Where did it come from? And so that was really how the whole thing started.
Wow. And did he have like another Burgundian wine there? I've been reading your memoir, so I kind of know the inside story here, but were you tasting another one as well?
Yes, there was another red wine, which was neither here nor there. I mean, it was just a perfectly decent red wine. So there was this contrast. It is perfectly true that if you want to look at a wine clearly, it's a very good idea to make a comparison with another wine, and you get a focus. On that occasion, that's quite true. I mean, sip, put that away, no interest, sip. Oh, my goodness. Hey, what's going on here? A different world.
Absolutely. And were they located close to each other in terms of where the vines were planted?
I don't honestly remember. No, I mean, one came from a famous vineyard in Burgundy, and the other was just a red wine. I mean, he was drawing my attention to something that I hadn't really considered before. So it was that kind of Damascus moment.
Yes. Ah, awesome. Now, your college was also well stocked with a certain champagne that I think you had a Churchillian fondness for. What was that one?
Ah, I know you mean Pol Roger. A
Yes.
certain champagne. I've had an account with the house of Pol Roger drinking their white foil, which is their non-vintage wine, for about 60 years. I first started to drink it when I was at Cambridge, and I still do. Although, more recently, I've been switching over to something quite different, which is English sparkling wine, because now we have a really, really successful, indeed a brilliant wine industry in England. The moment has come. It's global warming's got something to do with it, obviously, but we are now using the champagne grapes to make a wine that I am beginning to prefer, quite honestly, to regular champagne.
Wow, that's saying something. Go toe to toe with champagne.
It's got a sort of freshness to it. It's like going into a lovely apple orchard, and it sort of brightens your palate. And I taste champagne, and I think, well, I'm very used to that, but I find excitement in the English version.
We'll have to get to know English champagne better or English bubbly, I should say, better over here in Canada, because we don't get it very often, but I've heard marvelous things about it.
To be honest, there isn't much of it. It's a new industry.
Well, save some for us. Send some over the Atlantic sometime. You describe bubbly as a giggly wine. I love that phrase. And you mentioned a fascinating tidbit that's kind of proves that from the scientific perspective. What's happening with sparkling wine or bubbly as it relates to CO2?
Well, it's an interesting thing. When you drink it, you are obviously swallowing in the bubbles carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is not something that the body really is very keen to have inside it. So it goes into your tummy and it very rapidly gets into your bloodstream straight away. I mean, within seconds, your blood absorbs carbon dioxide and wants to get rid of it. So it races around your system. You know, this is not a medical lecture, but this is my understanding, and goes straight to where it counts in your brain. So you get giggly alarmingly fast.
Wow. Yeah. The heart wants to get it out of its system as though you're working out almost. Do you think that it's a requirement or a good thing even to taste high quality wines at the beginning of your wine journey? Is that important to understand wines, to taste really top quality wines at the beginning?
I think it's important to realize how different the quality can be. So, you know, if you only ever drank the best wine, you would think, well, that's the standard. That's what I can expect wine to be. But if you drink it and something less, of lesser quality, more ordinary, then you're bound to notice and say, this is so much better. Why? Where's it come from?
It's true. It's always the comparison. And as you say so eloquently, and I won't be able to paraphrase as eloquently, you bring yourself to the point of being able to see where the pleasure lies. You don't want to perhaps leap to high price wines right away, but you need to know the differences.
Oh, yes, I mean, there is a place for great wine if you can afford it. And there's obviously a place for what I call everyday wine. And in between, I'm sort of make rather artificial grades. There's a whole category that I call fine wine. And people ask me, well, what do you mean by fine wine? And I tend to say, well, it's wine that's worth talking about. You see, ordinary wine is just wine. There's nothing more to say. Fine wine, you say to yourself, hey, not quite what I expected, or it's really rather delicious, or I love the smell, or something like that. And then you get into a category that generally I call fine. In between, you know, okay, wine, basic, good wine, better and something you really want. Fine wine, something that you ask questions about. I always say that fine wine doesn't make statements, it asks questions. You want to know more.
And what kind of questions does it ask you? It just provokes your curiosity. Can you think of a wine that kind of asked you a lot of questions?
So basically it makes you want to, well, have more. I mean, sip again, sniff it more deeply, concentrate on it, pay attention to it. I think that some people make the mistake that very good wine will somehow tell you it's very good at the first sip. Well, it might, but the first thing you have to do is concentrate to notice it. It's the first rule of wine tasting. The sort of rigmarole is you look at the colour, you sniff it, you take a sip. But then when you take a sip, you actually think. You keep it in your mouth for a moment or two, and you sort of chew it, you swirl it around a bit. Then it registers, and you've actually had the experience, and then you can, like it or not like it, you can judge it. Then you've really had that wine's experience.
Great advice for tasting, for everyone who wants to improve their tasting ability or just their pleasure. You described your writing career as taking off when you began writing for Vogue magazine, and you published your first article for the magazine in the December 1960 issue. What was it about?
Good Lord, it's quite the Christmas issue. The editor sent me off and said, you want to write about wine, Hugh? Because I was a general sort of feature writer at the time. And I said, yes. She said, well, what are we going to do for Christmas? And I said, well, suppose I ask 2 or 3 people who are known for their love of wine, possibly for their riches as well, what they're going to have for Christmas. So I went round and I did. I mean, I collared a famous millionaire. Anyway, a couple of well-known names. And I took down their answers, and that was my first wine article.
Wines for Christmas, how seasonal. It's a topic that comes up every year, 60 years later. Which wines for Christmas or holiday turkey?
But it's like one of the great virtues of wine as a subject for a writer. There's always a new vintage.
That's true.
She sold many, many copies of my little annual Hugh Johnson's Pocket Wine book because there's always news on the wine front. You know, if we were talking about trees, which is the other subject I love writing about, you know, an oak remains an oak. It's not a different oak next year.
Right. That's true. It's got this built-in renewal cycle to it for both the plants and the writer. Yeah. That's great. And how did working at such a fashion-focused magazine like Vogue shape your approach to writing about wine, or did it?
No, not really. I think it was just I wanted somebody to publish my work. You know, I was brand new. I hadn't had anything published before. But I know what happened. I hadn't thought about this for the last half century. A friend of mine at Cambridge University had been offered a job on Vogue magazine. I can't think why he was, but he was. And then he was offered another job in television. And in those days, television was something very special. See how old I am. So he said, look, Vogue would take me on board. Why don't you do the job instead? And so I went and saw the editor of Vogue, and she said, well, yeah, give it a go. It must have worked.
I'd say it did. I think things rolled along pretty nicely after that, Hugh. That's great. Now, you published your first book on wine in 1966 when you were just 27 years old. What was it called, and what gave you the confidence to do that at such a young age?
Well, the title was just the 4-letter word, W-I-N-E, and my favorite. I know, God, you're reminding me of things I hadn't thought about for years.
I hope that's a good thing.
Oh, it is.
Okay.
The publisher had a smash hit with the first sort of coffee table cookbook. Made a beautiful production of it, color photos, and it sold. It was an American author called Robert Carrier, who became very well known as a result. He even got on television, imagine.
Oh, wow. What did he write about? What was that book about?
Oh, it was a book of recipes.
Oh, recipes. Okay, food. Uh-huh.
Yeah. His publisher had the idea, or was given the idea, that if you could sell a coffee table book about cooking, perhaps you could about wine. So he asked me to come up with big book, coloured cover, colour plates. I mean, in those days in publishing, text and pictures were not integrated very much. It was so much simpler to have a colour page printing separately the text, and so they weren't properly integrated. It looked pretty primitive by today's standards, but that's the way it was. So I had to take these colour photographs, and that's where I discovered my skills as a photographer. I went out with my Rolleiflex camera and photographed everything that I thought looked good in the wine field. I did still lifes, masterpieces, of course, because they were published. Anyway, the first book, that's how it came about.
Wow. And did your experience as a magazine editor help you to better integrate like the color photos, the captions, and I think, as you call the text, the gray stuff?
Good point, but that came later, you see. This first book was very simple. It was just text and colour plates. And then I went back into the magazine business. I've been working for Condé Nast, for Vogue, House and Garden. They started a little magazine which was actually called Wine and Food. And I was given the editorship. And so I learned quite a lot about editing. And I thought we could integrate things. And then came the offer. That's right, I was editing a magazine called Queen, which was the sort of fashion and social glossy of the time in London. And I'd done that for not very long when an editor came to me and said, "We are working with a Dutch cartographer, a map maker. And he says, what about the relationship between maps and wine? Because wines are called after where they come from. So suppose we show people these places." And I said, wow, but could you afford really good maps? I mean, I would want Ordnance Survey level maps. And he somehow produced a huge advance for the book. By those standards of those days, I do remember it was £100,000, which today would be $1 million.
Yeah. Whoa.
And so we created these absolutely amazing maps, really. We were the first people to map the vineyards of the world in this degree of detail. And once you get to the detail, then you could really explain the differences. And you could say this could be simple, this is a south-facing hill slope, or it's not, it's something else. And you show it to people. That actually was quite revolutionary, because instead of just, in the text, you have a list of names, and you say, this is the Medoc, and it goes Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux, blah, blah. But actually, if you show them that this is the land itself, look at it. The detail, you can decide where to have your picnic. So that was totally convincing, and that really worked. And the book sold, and still sells.
It does. It does. And that was in 1971. And things have changed so much. There's been multiple editions since. But am I correct in asking, was New Zealand not even in that book because literally New Zealand wines weren't on the map yet?
There wasn't any New Zealand wine at all.
Right. Wow.
There was something called Dalle Plonk. I have to explain that.
Okay.
Because a lot of the miners in New Zealand were immigrants from Dalmatia, and they were called Dalles. Dalmatia being a wine-growing country, they planted vines and they made wine. And so this was pretty much the first New Zealand wine, Dalle Plonk. And then they realized that it was much better than Plonk. They really have the climate, a very similar climate to France in some cases, and they could upgrade, and they did.
Yeah. You've just seen so many changes over the years. I mean, from the time you started to now. What's been the most surprising change you've seen in the world of wine, if you can name one? I know there's been many.
There are so many. A general upgrade in quality, there's no doubt about that. I mean, you used to be able, without any difficulty, to find bad wine. Now, I really challenge almost anybody now to go out and buy a bad wine. We don't need to make it, so we don't do it. I mean, the technique has been perfected, and we've also, of course, good wine, certainly fine wine, used to be limited pretty much to France, a little bit to Italy, Germany, definitely to Austria, funnily enough, and that was it. Other people made perfectly decent wine, but not fine wine. They didn't see it in that way. Well, that idea sunk in, and people realized that basis of any fine wine was the grape variety. So they started to look at the grape varieties. And I do remember, actually, in the States, there was a friend of mine who was a war correspondent in the Second World War called Frank Schoonmaker. And he'd been in France during the war, and he had learned to taste wine in Burgundy, I think. And Frank wrote for the New York Times, and he wrote a little wine encyclopedia. And he asked me to do an English version of it, or to get rid of the Americanisms. and so we published it in England, and it was a big success. And so how did I get round to talking about Frank?
You're talking about fine wines and identifying them through the grapes, that sort of thing, as the appreciation developed.
When California wine was pretty plonky, frankly, there was very little fine wine, if any, in California then. He was advising them, and he told them that if they were going to make better white wine, they were planting Chardonnay grapes. The best red wine was from Cabernet Sauvignon grapes. It was as simple as that. And he said, well, put it on the label. Don't just say something county, but put the grape variety on the label. That was immediately convincing. It had sort of raised the bar. If you're planting the best grape varieties, you can expect better wine. That was a historic moment. It really was.
That's revolutionary for even the understanding of wine, appreciation of it here in North America, to be able to identify and ask for a certain grape. Because up till then, it had all been just regions, and Europe was a kind of a mystery because it was all regional. People weren't sure what the grapes were if they, didn't have wine knowledge. Well, speaking of fine wines, tell us about buying your first bottle of 1961 Bordeaux. I think it was actually a mixed case that you bought, and maybe tell us what you paid for it.
Well, 1961 came around, and it was very clear from the beginning there was going to be a great vintage. I mean, the weather conditions were right. It was a warm summer. The grapes ripened at the right time. They were not overbaked when they were picked in the vintage time. And people tasted it and said, this has everything. The only vintage of my lifetime, I think, when the consensus has been, this has everything. I was carried away by this, and I spent little of my tiny earnings, it must have been a month's wages, I should think, on buying a mixed case of the first growth from Bordeaux of that wine. And I resisted drinking it because I had learned that, great wine is a matter of time. You don't just buy it and drink it. I think I drank my last bottle of those 4 different first growths about, like 40 years later.
Wow.
So it had evolved. It had gone through this sort of magic maturation, that mellowing that wine does, and it become a different substance and magic.
Wow. Very patient, waiting for it that long. And that would have been like Lafite, Latour, Margaux?
Yes, exactly. It was Lafite, Latour, Margaux, and Haut-Brion, the 4 great first growths.
Magical. Do you remember what you paid for it? I know it was a month's earnings, but do you remember the price back then?
I mean, I'm more familiar with them now, obviously. So, yes. Basically,
true.
I know why it was a great, great pleasure, great moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you've reflected in your book on Bordeaux from 1982, you describe it as a year of pleasure where personal milestones intertwine with wine moments. And I love the way you weave those two together. Was there a particular moment or wine that stood out for you that year?
In 82, I don't remember it for one amazing bottle, but lots of amazing bottles. That was the way it was. It was very untypical of the Bordeaux that I got used to up to then, because it was a very warm year. And it pleased the great American wine critic, Robert Parker. And he was always looking for concentration in wine, dark color in red wine, high alcohol content. He wasn't into subtlety at all, old Parker. But
You said you had to have a stomach for hyperbole to read some of the tasting notes.
yes,
Subtle way to put it.
we were friendly, but we never read from the same page at all.
Right. But you did read a few of his pages back in 1978 when you were with your publisher. It was your first time not only encountering Robert Parker, but tell us about that. It was your first time encountering something else when it came to wine and description.
You've got all the stories. Yes, it's
Great stories.
My London publisher came up to me and said, "This book is doing amazingly in America. It's just rushing off the shelves. Why don't you read it and have a look?" I did, and I said, it was well edited, and in the margin it went through the vintages. Okay, sort of 78, 79, 80, 81. And then there was another figure beside it, a figure like 90 or 92 or something like that. And I said, "Yeah, that's the vintage, but what's this figure here? That's the score." I said, "The what? Score? Wines don't have scores. How can you score wine?" And they said, "Well, it's Detroit does it with motor cars. You know, Americans like scores. They like to know where they are in some ranking, which is unspecified, really. It's the palate of a critic who gets more and more excited and ups the score." And I said, "Well, you can't do that. There is no objective scale. It's giving the wrong impression to people to say that this wine is better in an abstract way than another wine." Maybe my mind has changed about that a little. But at the time, I said, it's not mechanistic like that at all. Wines are good in different ways. A really good wine from the Loire in France can be brilliant in a lovely, fresh, refreshing way with lots of fruity flavors, which you won't find in a wine from the River Rhone, which is quite a different grape varieties, different climate, different qualities. So I said, "How do you score things as different as that?" I said, how about scoring Mozart operas? Or I try scoring your friends. Wines are my friends.
Exactly. How do you trap a subjective experience into what seems like an objective number? Just seems kind of tricky. Have you changed your mind a little bit on scores? You alluded to that.
If you contextualize it, if you say we are scoring things within a narrow range of qualities and so on, then obviously you can make it happen. And it has to happen all the time, because that's how professional wine tasters do their job. I mean, in some cases, the American way was to mark out of 100, or rather, that's not quite true. As in school exam marking, it ran from 50 to 100. So nothing was humiliating by scoring 20. Nobody ever did mark as low as 50. I mean, if you look at the Parker type scores in wine magazines and that kind of thing, even the wine they really don't like will get something like 70. But then there's a lot of hyperbole as the scores get more exciting.
So you think within a context they could be useful today?
Oh, yes. I mean, if I'm at a wine tasting, a professional tasting, I'm usually given a sort of sheet of paper with the names of the wines. The other tasters, there were always a bunch of us, will write down scores. What I do in that case, very often on a bench along the wall, the wine bottles are lined up. And as I go along the line, sniffing and sipping and spitting, if I like something, I'll pull the bottle a bit towards me. And if I don't, I'll push it a bit back. So at the end of the tasting, you get a sort of jagged line like that. And I know which my favourites have been, and I go back and taste them again and come to a conclusion, or try to.
Right. I think that's a great way to do it. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Hugh. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, what advice does Hugh have on improving your wine tasting skills and pleasure? Well, as Hugh says, the first thing you have to do is concentrate on the wine. Look at the color, smell it, take a sip, and then when you actually do take a sip, think about it. Keep it in your mouth for a moment or two. Chew on it. Swirl it, and until it registers, then you can experience the wine more fully. Number 2, why was Hugh initially against wine scoring, and how has his perspective changed over the years? Hugh asks, how can you score a wine any more than you can score Mozart or your friends? I'd like to try that, actually. He didn't believe in an objective scale or giving the wrong impression that one wine is better than another. For example, he notes a good wine from the Loire Valley in France can be brilliant in a lovely, fresh way with lots of fruity flavors, which you're not going to find in a wine from the Rhone. They're different grapes, climates, styles. Over the years, though, he has accepted scoring within a narrow range, say for a wine competition category, where all the wines are from the same grape and region, and you're trying to differentiate for the purposes of giving medals or awards. Though he adds, no one has ever scored a wine lower than 50, so it's not really a relevant range. And I would add, with great inflation, we rarely see scores below 89 these days. Guilty as charged. Number 3, what makes a wine great, in Hugh's opinion? As Hugh says, people ask me, well, what do you mean by fine wine? He says, well, it's a wine worth talking about. You see ordinary wine, has nothing more to say. Fine wine, you ask yourself, hey, that's not what I expected. What's going on here? Or I love the smell, or something like that. Fine wine is something you ask questions about. It doesn't make statements. It asks questions. You want to know more. It makes you want another sip. It draws you in. And I love that definition. And 4, why does Hugh now prefer English sparkling wines over his longtime favorite, Pol Roger Champagne? Hugh says he's had an account with the house of Pol Roger for almost 60 years. Oh my gosh, I love even the sound of it. I have an account with Pol Roger. He first drank it at Cambridge University, but more recently he's been switching to English sparkling wine. He observes they have a brilliant wine industry in the country. Climate change is part of it, but they're also now using champagne grapes to make the wine. It's got freshness. It's like going to an apple orchard, he says. It really brightens your palate. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of our conversation with Hugh, links to his website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 209, go back and take a listen. I chat with another leading light in the world of wine, the Napa-based Karen McNeil, author of the Wine Bible. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
The world of wine is now a really big place. I'm a very rigorous researcher. I will spend 2 weeks on one little fact within a sentence, within 30,000 sentences, to be sure that I know something really. The Wine Bible doesn't cut any corners. I'll give you an example. I mean, most people would say something like, when wine glasses were invented, comma, blah, 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 is true. The Wine Bible sentence would be, when wine glasses were invented in 1615, comma, da-da-da-da-da, is true.
Specific.
It's really laced through with concrete information, even in the simplest sentence. And so it takes a while to figure those things out.
Absolutely. And yet it's more useful because of the density of information that is still not yet overwhelming. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Hugh. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about how to deepen their knowledge and enjoyment of wine from the industry's most renowned writer. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemaclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or if you'd like to win a copy of any of the books I mentioned today in the intro, including Hugh's, or if you've read my book or are listening to it. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Were you surprised at Hugh's take on wine scores? What do you think about them? Do you agree with his definition on what makes a wine great? And what's the greatest wine you've ever tasted so far? Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In the show notes, you'll also find a link to take a free online wine and food pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. And that is all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/313. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a wine that is the liquid embodiment of greatness and pleasure for you. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.